Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Este é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. The library smelled the way Allesia liked the world to smell. Paper that had lived in other hands, the oily tang of linseed from a painting she had been cataloguing earlier, a dust sweetness that settled into the hollows of the skull and made thinking feel like prayer. Light from the high windows slanted across the reading tables in late winter angles, cutting the room into thin, patient slices. She pushed her hair behind one ear and listened to the hush. A soft machine hum, a distant tram bell, the slight rasp of pages turning in a corner. Here, among the stacks, the rest of her life could be arranged into sensible categories: provenance, attribution, margin notes. Here, the dread she carried like a small pebble in the stomach was a thing she could hold at arm's length. Her father's voice came back to her in snatches. "One more wager, Allais, then I'll stop." The way he had said it, soft, apologetic, as if the law were a kind of indiscretion rather than a gash, had become the substance of the pebble. She had seen the men in the alley earlier that week, shadows leaning against a battered Fiat, the way they tasted of cheap cologne and bad intentions. She had avoided thinking about the fines on the table at home, the envelope stuffed with what she had thought would be enough. It had not been. At 23, Allesia was not naive. She knew the arithmetic of favors in this city, who owed whom, who kept score, how a polite refusal could become a ledger with interest. But she still believed in the deliberateness of small, honest lives. She believed stubbornly that study and work could be a buffer against other people's appetites. The alley changed that belief in an hour. She left the library with a stack of thin catalogues clutched to her chest. The streets were colder than the building promised. She tightened her coat, pulled the wool scarf higher until it brushed her lips. The city smelled of wet stone and frying oil, something of lemon and a stray cigarette. Marco had insisted she'd take the longer way home. See the lights on the Via Mare, he'd said, in that way that made it both a tease and an order. He had a brother who lived on another side of the river, a brother she had only ever seen in photos. Tall, incline of cheekbone, the kind of presence that made a room rearrange itself. Dante Moretti, one of Marco's family names that came with a rumor and no invitation. She turned down a narrow street she used as a shortcut. The alley had no windows, only shuttered doors and a stray pile of pallets. Two men waited there with the casual confidence of predators. The pebble in her stomach hardened into a rock. "Miss Romano," one said, and his tone tried for friendliness and found only menace. "Your father owes us. You carry a message." She bared her teeth in a mask of composure. "My father will pay. He has." "Money," the other finished, "soon, or he will not see a winter again." His hand rested on the faded leather of a holster at his hip. The word winter meant many things. For a man with debts, it meant a threat. For Allesia, it meant a timeline measured in chances, and she had run out of them. She should have called Marco. She should have run. Her legs remembered the staircases of libraries and lecture halls. They did not remember sprinting. She said instead, "You don't have to. There must be another way." The taller man laughed low in his chest. "There is always another way, but my employer is hungry for payment, Signora. Time is not free." Everything in her recoiled. Her father's face in her mind was a map of small, foolish courtesies and that last exhausted apology. The world narrowed to the echo of those footsteps and the cold bite of the alley. Then a new sound threaded through the air. An engine cut low, and an unfamiliar shadow moved at the mouth of the passage. He arrived like a syllable leveling a sentence, smooth, controlled, and too precise to be accidental. Dante Moretti had the composure of someone who had navigated systems of power his whole life and found it easy. He wore a coat that made him look as if he had been sculpted in black wool. He did not hurry, he simply took possession of the space. The men in the alley shifted, suddenly aware they were in a room that contained a larger force. Dante, Marco's voice hummed in her ear like a warning ship's bell. She had not known Marco had followed at a distance. He emerged from the shadows, breathless, hands in his pockets, the kind of look he gave when he wanted to be serious and still looked boyish. Marco's presence should have been comfort. Instead, it complicated everything. For a moment, she allowed herself the petty, human observation that Marco looked smaller next to his brother than in his stories. Dante's eyes were colder than the wool of his coat. He scanned the men and took them in, as if reading print. "Let her be," he said. His voice had no edge, only an immutable certainty. The men laughed, short, quick, the sound of teeth. "Moretti," the taller one said. He had heard the name and measured its weight. "You will leave," Dante said. "Now." The taller man's hand moved toward his jacket. The alley smelled suddenly of damp earth and the metallic tang of panic. Marco stepped forward as if to block, but Dante's hand on his arm was a leash in silk. "All right," the man said. "We leave for now." He spat between his teeth like a promise. "But the debt stands." They melted back into the mouth of the street. For a moment, only the scrape of a distant cart punctured the silence. Allesia tried to breathe. "Thank you," she said to Dante, because the most civilized thing to do in a world that had just been soothed was to name the relief. Dante's expression did not soften. His dark eyes flicked to Marco, as if measuring his brother's competence, and found it wanting. "You should not walk alone," he said to Allesia. It was not an offer of help. It was a verdict. Your father's name was out now, a thing that the men had used like a key. There are transactions that happen in rooms where no law holds. Some debts barter futures. Dante continued to watch her, and under the observation she felt unstitched. "Who are you?" she asked, because every interaction in the alley required an identity in order to be navigable. He answered as if he had been waiting for the question. "Dante Moretti. I know people." That said little and everything. The Moretti name carried the sort of silence that had its own echo. Marco cleared his throat, called out, childish and useless, "Allez, you can call us at home." Almost gentleness brushed his face, and something in Dante's jaw tightened in a way that looked like a private hurt. He turned to Allesia fully, no longer the sentinel, but the man who had chosen to step into a life that required he be feared. "You will come to dinner with us tomorrow," he said. She should have said no. She should have called Marco and laughed and refused. But the alley had done what alleys do. It collapsed alternatives. She remembered the men's words, the way their laughter had snagged the air. Her father's debts were not the kind that one could patch with apologies. She had watched her mother pinch pennies without dignity for years. She did not want that life to become a debt collector's ledger. She thought of Marco's face, loyal and boyish, and of Dante's coat cutting the light. She thought of all the possible humiliations that could fall on her family if they could not manage this last thing. Why? She asked, and the air tasted of the bitter orange thrown into a simmering sauce. Because it is my bargain with the city, Dante said. Because sometimes a debt must be paid in a different coin. It was not the answer she needed. It was the answer he had, an elegant deflection wrapped in a threat. He smiled then, a small and private thing, and produced from his inside pocket a thin envelope. The gesture was clinical. He offered it like an artist would offer a piece of work. The envelope contained a card with an address and a time. It did not contain a promise. It contained a choice. "I can make them go away," he said. She considered every way to refuse. She thought of sleeping overnight on the library couch, of asking for help from teachers, of selling small things of her own. She thought of dignity and how fragile a concept it was. In the end, what decided her was not pride, but obligation. She imagined her father's hands when he finally found the money, clumsy, apologetic. She imagined the men returning for less patient terms. She thought of Marco's face, loyal and boyish, and of Dante's coat cutting the light. She thought of all the possible humiliations that could fall on her family if they could not manage this last thing. Why? She asked, and the air tasted of the bitter orange thrown into a simmering sauce. Because it is my bargain with the city, Dante said. Because sometimes a debt must be paid in a different coin. It was not the answer she needed. It was the answer he had, an elegant deflection wrapped in a threat. He smiled then, a small and private thing, and produced from his inside pocket a thin envelope. The gesture was clinical. He offered it like an artist would offer a piece of work. The envelope contained a card with an address and a time. It did not contain a promise. It contained a choice. "I can make them go away," he said. She considered every way to refuse. She thought of sleeping overnight on the library couch, of asking for help from teachers, of selling small things of her own. She thought of dignity and how fragile a concept it was. In the end, what decided her was not pride, but obligation. She imagined her father's hands when he finally found the money, clumsy, apologetic. She imagined the men returning for less patient terms. "What do you want?" she asked. Dante's hand, when it touched hers to close the distance between question and answer, was cool and unexpectedly light. "A public arrangement," he said. "A claim that I chose you as mine. Nothing more than that at first. A promise to stand by my side at public events, to be presented. I will ensure your father's safety." Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Você é narrador, palestrante, com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. A frase anterior era "E presented, I will ensure your father's safety." Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. I will... He hesitated, as if tasting a word for its weight. I will protect you. The word protect landed like a physical thing. There was malice folded into the offer, and mercy. And she understood both. He was bartering power for obedience, and in that exchange he expected her compliance. The offer was framed as rescue. It was rescue wrapped in a chain. "What does he expect?" Marco asked finally, the boy in him cracking through. "For how long?" Dante said, "Until the debts are settled, until whatever promises are made are kept. And after that, we will discuss terms." They stood there for a long second, breathing hard in the cleft between choice and coercion. The city around them unrolled late-night noise, indifferent. Everything in Allesia tightened into a moral problem that required immediate arithmetic. How much could she give to save her family? "You'll be expected to be seen," Dante said, "to move into the Moretti residence for a while, to attend dinners, to be presented as my—" he let the sentence hover, "engaged." The word engaged was dangerous and ceremonial. It arrived with gold and glass, with photographs that would find their way into papers Marco had no interest in publicizing. It also arrived with a promise of interference. She would be his, in the way one is the subject of a claim more than a partner. She had never been claimed like that. She had loved quietly, privately, like a book held open without display. The idea of becoming an exhibit made her skin prickle. Everything in her quivered between refusal and acceptance. She thought of the men in the alley. She thought of her father's thin smile. She thought of Marco's face. Betrayal had already been born on it, though he did not speak it aloud. "What if I say no?" she asked. Dante's eyes narrowed only a degree, and for the first time she saw the man who had to make decisions that cost blood. "Then you will have time to think about what happens when the men who come tonight are patience's limit," he said. "You have the wrong kind of courage if you choose danger over careful calculation." The envelope shifted in his hand. He was offering her a way to trade one form of loss for another. Exchange private dignity for a measured public life, where at least her family would not be harmed. It was not a good bargain. It was a bargain that would leave stains. "All right," she said at last. The word felt like a stone dropped into still water. It made rings that would ripple outward, touching every arrangement of the life she had known. Marco closed his mouth. Dante's face did not change the way it would if he felt triumph. There was only businesslike reserve, as if he had expected nothing less. "Tomorrow, 7, he said, "at the villa. Bring something decent." A cold sweep of shame rose hot and immediate in her chest. "You can't," she began, and could not finish the sentence because everything that mattered had a price. "You asked for an option," Dante said. "I offered one. Choose." She went home that night in a kind of stupor, folding herself into the small lamp-lit kitchen where her father sat hunched over a crossword with the posture of a man who had exhausted his tricks. He looked up when she entered, and his face broke into a grin that was too much like relief for her to bear. "Ale," he said, his voice small with gratitude. He reached without thinking and took her hand as if to keep from drifting away. "You told him," she said. She did not know whom she blamed more, the men who had threatened or the brother of a friend who saw rescue as a transaction. "I told Marco," he said. "That's all." His fingers were shaking. "I will go to the bank. I will—" "It's done," she said. "It's done because I said yes." His face went blank for a moment, as if he had been asked to conceive a future that did not have him in it. Then he squeezed her hand like a benediction and turned back to the crossword, as if the small, ridiculous grid could order shame into comprehensible squares.
Allesia sat at the little table, the kitchen light painting the room in yellow, and tasted the shape of a life rearranged. The Moretti villa lived on a hill and felt at once ancient and newly renovated, a house that had decided architecture should be as much a signature as a shelter. Marble stairs, high ceilings, a fountain with bronze figures frozen mid-gesture. A room smelled of polished wood, leather, and the faint, clean aroma of citrus. When Dante opened the door, the world inside him did not soften, but the threshold had a way of magnifying delicate movements into declarations. He led her through a corridor lined with portraits that watched without judgment, and into a drawing room where the appointed guests gathered with the patience of the accustomed. Dinner was a ceremony. There were wines spoken of obliquely, courses that arrived in quiet procession, and talk that skimmed the surface of statecraft and art. Allesia sat with her hands folded like a supplicant's, aware of how each movement might be photographed in some private ledger of observation. Mrs. Moretti, who was as large and warm as the house itself, poured red on the china and asked about her studies with a practiced sweetness. Mr. Moretti nodded once and spoke in a voice that filled rooms without being loud. Marco hovered near the doorway, a figure who had not yet learned how to receive the consequences of his lineage. At some point in the night, there was a small hush, and Dante turned to her and said simply, "This is not forever." "I know," she said. The words held a truth and a lie at once. There was comfort in the promise, even while it sliced like a blade. Later, Marco found her on the terrace beneath an incised sky. The city lay below as a smear of light and distant motion. "You did what you had to do," and his voice was not reproach, but a broken absolution. "You don't have to forgive me," she said. Her throat felt hollow with things unsaid. "I'm not angry with you," he said. "I'm angry at him." He nodded toward the house. "And at myself for not seeing it coming." They sat in silence. The night air smelled of sea and cold citrus. A breeze came up and tugged at the hems of their coats. In the doorway, Dante watched them both. It was impossible to tell what he thought. He closed the distance between them, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet in a new way. "We will take care of your father," he said. "In exchange, you will be Moretti's fiancé." The word fiancé came again, wrapped now in domestic monopoly. She looked at him, really looked, searching for the heart she suspected was hidden beneath armor. For the first time, she saw a fissure in his certainty, a place where loneliness had settled like dust. He was not simply a man who traded power. He was a man who understood his own wants and hid them behind duties. "You understand this is coercion," she said. The sentence was simple and true. It was a naming of the alley, of the palms that had rested on her shoulders in the dark. Dante inclined his head, as if accepting a verdict rendered by the obvious. "I understand," he said, "but some bargains must be struck in bloodless ways." "You make it sound noble," she said. "Of many things, nothing is noble," he said, "only effective." When he reached into his pocket and produced a ring, an object of practical weight and deliberate design, Alessia's breath stilled. It was not jewelry so much as a token, a circle of cold metal that could be read as a promise or a leash. He did not slip it on her finger. He extended it, an offer made public by the small private motion. She thought of the ledger of debt, of the men in the alley, of her father's cross-bent shoulders. She thought of Marco's trust and how fragile it would be now that family had become a currency. She thought too of the possibility, however small, that living inside a fortress might give her the room to learn how to be less afraid. She had not imagined falling in love with power, but she had imagined, in softer moments, finding someone who thought of her as more than a ledger. For now she took the ring between two fingers and felt its metal cool against her skin. She looked up and met Dante's gaze. "All right," she said, "I will do it." He did not smile like a man redeemed. He only nodded, and the steel in him softened minutely, as if the arrangement between them had shifted from negotiation to a fragile truce. Outside, the city turned and folded its night into obligations. Inside, under chandelier light and the watchful eyes of portraits, Allesia felt the small, inevitable gravity of decisions. She had traded one form of danger for another. The room hummed with possibilities she could not yet name. She slept that night in a borrowed peace that felt like a pause, not an ending.
In the morning, when she packed the narrow suitcase she had left behind in a cupboard at her father's, she wrapped her books in tissue as if they might be smuggled out of a country. Her mother pressed a plate of lasagna into her hands, cheeks damp, mothering a daughter into a world of men. Her father kissed the top of her head with a sound that was almost prayer. When she crossed the threshold of the Moretti villa for the second time, the house did not seem as foreign as it had the night before. The furniture took in her scent and accepted it as a new variable. Maria, the housekeeper, watched her from the doorway with the kind of appraisal that belonged to people who kept houses and histories both in order. "Rules," Maria said in the practical voice of a woman who had seen many arrangements. She handed Allesia a list written in careful hand. "You learn them. You keep them. You will be asked to keep up appearances." Allesia folded the paper and tucked it into her pocket, the rules sliding against her hip like a reminder of everything she now inhabited. A role, a claim, a ceremony that would stand in for the messy human repairs she wanted to her family. Dante's office became the one place that felt truly private, not because it was warm or welcoming, but because it closed like a book. The room smelled of old paper and lemon oil. A single lamp burned low. Dante sat behind the desk as if he belonged to the room the way light belonged to a candle. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty. It contained the outlines of proposals and unsaid confessions. "You will be presented next week at the charity ball," he said finally. "You will wear something you can move in. You will smile when necessary." "And after that?" Allesia asked. "After that," he said, and for the first time a different timbre entered his voice, "you will have the right to speak for yourself in questions that concern us both." She nearly laughed at the conditionality of that sentence. "That sounds very generous." "It is a start," he said. There was a small domestic movement in the room then. Dante took from a drawer a key. It was heavy and old, the kind of object that carried a story in its metal. He set it on the desk and slid it toward her. "This opens my study," he said, "not as an invitation to invade, but as a cautionary piece. You will have access to it when you are ready." Allesia touched the key with 2 fingers. It was cool and heavy. The gesture was symbolic. It carried promise and power, each in equal measure. It was also, in a small but potent way, a trust. She looked at him and saw, for a flicker, the man behind the power, not monstrous, not wholly benevolent, but capable of laying down something like faith. There were things she would not say then. How his hand had felt on hers in the alley like a transaction and like a lifeline. How she could not yet tell whether her heart would harden into a shield or dissolve into something else. For now,
She kept a ledger of small debts and small kindnesses, and learned how to live inside the walls he had built for her. Outside, a storm was forecast for the weekend. The news on a tiny television in the corner of the villa's kitchen spoke of rain and rising tides. The sky darkened at the horizon the way a wound bruises under the skin. Inside, the fountain tinkled, and life resumed an uneasy domesticity. On the terrace, one evening, not long after her arrival, Dante found her standing alone, palms braced on the stone rail. The city below was a scatter of lights. The sea beyond it was the dark that held everything together. He came up beside her without fanfare, and they watched for a while in companionable silence. "You are not like the women who come here before," he said. She considered. Was that meant as insult or assessment? "I'm not a thing to be collected," she said. He did not protest. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something she had not seen on him before, a small photograph, dog-eared at the corners. He held it out to her. It was a family portrait, less formal than the paintings in the halls, a snapshot, a younger Dante, a woman with his eyes and a softness in her smile. He said, "My mother," he said. "She saw me before I became this." Allesia looked at the face and saw a vulnerability she had not expected. "She looks kind," she said. She was, he agreed. She loved the city with a devotion that was both quiet and absolute. "I owe her much." A thunderhead gathered at the edge of the world. The scent of coming rain came in on the breeze, and with it, the sense that thresholds were mutable. Allesia felt something inside her rearrange, fear and possibility braided together like roots. Dante's hand brushed hers on the rail, in a movement that was almost accidental and almost intentional. For a second, a thin knife of time, there was a dangerous nearness. Both felt it. Then he withdrew, leaving the air charged between them like a wire. "You have made the right decision," he said, softly, not in argument, but as a statement whose truth had yet to be tested. "We will keep your family safe. We will honor the arrangement." She met his gaze. "And what of me?" she asked. He did not answer at once. The storm gathered, the city held its breath, and in the distance, a first drop of rain stitched the air. In the hush before weather and movement, Allesia felt the world tilt and the choice she had made crystallize into a path whose end she could not yet see. She thought about consent then, not the legalities, but the inner assent that builds slowly between two people when fear loosens and something like trust begins to grow. She hoped, with a near terrifying ferocity, that whatever grew between them would be chosen and not merely endured. The thunder rolled in. The terrace was suddenly damp at the edges. Dante offered her his jacket. She took it and felt his shoulder brush hers. The contact was brief, charged, and entirely proper in the face of weather. Yet under propriety, something else thrummed, an awareness of the narrowness of their starting point and the long, complicated road ahead. The rain came down in sheets that night, drumming on the villa roof like applause or accusation. In the library below, among dusty spines and the faint smell of oil, they met again. This time in a room designed for solitude, surrounded by books that made promises about endurance and endurance alone. He closed the door, and for the first time, without the choreography of guests or duty, Dante looked at her as if he wanted to see what would happen if he took off his armor and simply existed in a room with another human being. The look was not wholly tender. It was more like the examination of something fragile and possibly valuable. "Are you comfortable?" he asked. She allowed herself a small, rueful smile. "Comfortable is not the word I would use," she said, "but I am content." He nodded. "Good," he said. "Content is better than frantic." They talked then, badly at first, as two people who had rehearsed speeches for different audiences, and were trying tentatively to speak as themselves. He told her, in jagged sentences, about the absences that had shaped him, his mother's death, the responsibilities that had folded into him like a costume. She told him, in steadier phrases, about the smells of oil paint and the solace of books and the small rebellions of a life spent learning. The storm outside matched the slow thunder of confession inside. At one point, when lightning flung the room into stark relief and then receded, something between them shifted and the distance closed. He took her hand, not as an owner might, but as a man learning how to be proximate without consuming. His thumb brushed the back of her knuckles. It was a small, decisive permission. "Do you trust me?" he asked. Her answer had to be honest to be useful. "I trust you to keep your word," she said. "I do not trust you to be gentle until I have reason to believe you will be." He absorbed that with the solemnity of a man reading conditions on a contract. "Fair," he said. The storm moved through the night like a commentary. When it finally broke and the world breathed clean air, Allesia crawled into the small bed the house had given her and slept with an eye open to the room. She had stepped across a boundary to keep her family safe. The bargain was not a solution so much as a beginning. It would demand 1,000 small negotiations, many acts of restraint, and more courage than she had thought herself capable of. Outside, the villa's fountain threw up its last spray.
Guia de estilo e instruções para síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "And the villa's fountain threw up its last spray." Você está no meio de uma frase, pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal, sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. Fim das instruções. Inside, the Moretti's household rearranged itself to accommodate a new variable. Marco was distant in the days that followed, a friend transformed by family loyalties. But he still brought her coffee late at night and stood in doorways with expressions that vacillated between concern and reproach. Maria taught her which knives to use in the kitchen and which subjects to decline. Dante observed with a patience that belonged to a predator who had learned to hunger in measured ways. And in the slow hours, when she was alone in Dante's study with only the hum of the radiators and the occasional scrape of a pen, Allesia began, very carefully, to place herself into the ledger as more than an entry. She began to ask questions. She learned the weight of a key and the ritual of a household where power looked like order and care like calculation. There would be storms yet that did not come from the sky. There would be betrayals that would bruise and rescues that would cost. But on that terrace beneath the weather, with a man who carried darkness like a coat and a friend who remained a witness, Allesia felt the first tentative stirrings of a life remade by choice and necessity both. The bargain had been struck in an alley. The labor of living it out would begin on a table laid for many dinners. A door closed softly behind her, and the house settled. Rain pattered on stone. In the distance, the harbor swallowed the light. Inside, in a room of leather and paper, two people sat close enough that distance felt negotiable. Outside, the city went on being indifferent. Allesia fingered the ring in her pocket and for the first time wondered whether the circle would become a key or a chain. She had chosen to keep her family whole. The price had been herself, in part.
What she would become inside those walls, what Dante would become in turn, remained a question whose answer would be written in small gestures, in the steadiness of a hand, in the keeping of promises, in the soft mechanics of trust. When the storm returned on the weekend with a fury that made the sea angry and the city curl up against it, the household moved in rhythms that protected and hid. And on the night the wind threw itself against the shutters and lightning painted the room in sudden white, something close to a confession happened in the library between the books and the two people who had begun a life on terms neither of them had chosen wholly. It was not a ceremony, it was not a conquest, it was an intimacy negotiated through the language of consent and hesitation, of small questions and measured answers. It was imperfect and human, and in that imperfection, dangerously promising. Outside, the rain eased. The Moretti villa, vast and watchful, kept its secrets.
Allesia, with a ring in her pocket and a ledger of obligations beginning to be rewritten by human hands, learned the first lesson of living where power dictates the terms. The only thing you can ever truly own is your choice in the face of constraint. The rest is practice. Dawn came slow and stained, the villa's stone taking on the color of old bones as Allesia moved through rooms that still smelled faintly of rain and the lemon oil Maria used on the stairs. The household was waking in small, efficient waves. The scullery clattering, a boy bringing coals, Maria at the pantry with a cloth at her shoulder. Dante's study, where she had spent so many hours learning the measure of keys and the weight of promises, held the quiet of a room that had been used as a map. A book lay open on the desk, a pen with a blot of ink on its side. Dante's morning was being arranged in margins and lists. She sat at the far end of the long table and felt the ring in her pocket like a thing with its own pulse. It had not yet become either key or chain. It had a presence, a small, cold certainty. Across the table, Marco poured coffee with hands that trembled sometimes from too much wakefulness, and when he set the cup beside her, he watched her with that odd combination of brotherly solicitude and the distance of someone who had been taught to be careful with what he cared for. "Coffee?" he offered, as if the vessel were a treaty. Allesia accepted. The warmth steadied her. "How did you sleep?" he asked. "Well enough," she said. "The house is quieter than I expected." Marco's mouth tightened. Quiet is a kind of danger. It hides steps. She glanced toward the windows. The shutters had been opened a crack, and a thread of sea light came in. "I'm learning which steps to listen for," she said. Later, when the household had arranged itself into the day's small economy, Maria took Allesia by the elbow and led her through the rooms as if through a cathedral where every object had a liturgy. The knives in the kitchen were not merely tools. Their placement was a language. One blade for bread, another for meat, one for sharpening. The silver in the cabinet had been catalogued by a nephew of Dante's who liked to write the date of acquisition on slips of paper. Maria showed her how to lay a cloth, how to fold a napkin so it suggested deliberateness and not over-eagerness, how to pass a plate with the slight turn of the wrist that deferred attention from the passer to the company. "People notice small errors more than grand ones," Maria said, as they turned a corner into a corridor heavy with portraits. "The wrong spoon, a misaligned glass. A woman who fumbles is a woman who worries. You don't want to be mistaken for being worried." Everything in Maria's voice was economy. There was no cruelty in it, only the steady knowledge of how matters kept their shape.
Allesia wanted to ask whether she would ever stop feeling like she was faking authority, but the question sounded like a confession, and Mariah wasn't in the business of confessions. Instead, Mariah pressed a hand to the back door, the one leading toward the terraces. "Tonight there will be company," she said. "Dante expects guests. You will be where he directs. Remember the names you are told. Remember the small things." When Dante's guests arrived, they did so like a tide. Families with histories, men who carried reputations like paperweights, women whose jewelry glinted with the way a pledge might. The salon filled with the soft human noise of polite remarks that were, more often than not, weapons in disguise. Dante welcomed each with a smile that read like a ledger entry, a number, a consequence. He moved among them with the easy referee's air of a man who knew the rules and the players. Allesia stood near him, ring in her pocket, her posture practiced. People saw what they expected to see, a housewoman, a careful addition to the household troupe. But some looked longer. A man, sinister in the way of men who have learned delicacy is an instrument, made a loose, almost private joke and leaned too close, as if to test the surface. Allesia felt the advance before his words formed, a small, predatory curiosity that mistook passivity for invitation. She could have stepped back. She could have relied on Dante's gravity to move the air around her. Instead, she listened for the measures Mariah had taught her, the placement of a napkin, the absence of a flinch, and used them like armor. When the man offered his hand, she took it with a steadiness that startled him into withdrawing his expected smirk. It was small, it was not victory, but the withdrawal was a fact. Dante watched from a distance that was not quite attentive, like someone who could see a draft under a door and choose whether to seal it. After the man left with flattery tucked into his pocket, Dante inclined his head toward Allesia as if remarking upon a line in a book. "You did well," he said later, in the privacy of the library where the rain had once again begun to write on the panes. "You were deliberate." She considered the word. Deliberate sounded like a currency she had not yet earned. "I am learning," she said. He sat opposite her, hands folded, the profile of a man accustomed to being looked at as a whole plan. "You will have to be more than learning," he said. "Deliberation becomes practice. Practice becomes habit. Habit becomes influence." Everything fell then into the narrow arithmetic she had come to know, words promising an elevator with stairs. She wanted to ask what price Dante intended to pay for the influence he offered, but she felt the question as a weakness. "Do you know why I asked you to stay?" he asked, without preamble. To be honest would have been to let the ledger between them show its margins. She swallowed. "To help my family. To keep them from being scattered." He watched her. "And for you?" That question had a different tone. It did not seek a ledger entry. It sought a name. She hesitated. "For now," she said, "to learn how to stand where they cannot touch me." He allowed a small smile that did not reach his eyes. "Good answer," he said. There were nights, after guests drifted and the servants moved like shadows, replacing themselves in places they had been earlier, when Dante read to her from letters that concerned arrangements, investments, claims, disputes. He spoke in a language that was almost mathematical, claims and counterclaims, land and influence, and Allesia learned to translate it into human cost. There were names that came with histories of debts and favors. There were penalties written into lines of small print. If she had once believed power was thunder and the flourish of command, she now saw it as a ledger of tiny cruelties and mercies, the slow shifting of balances that left some accounts always at a loss. Then, on a morning when the sea was a sheet of pewter and the sky threatened rain, a visitor arrived who would not have been listed among Dante's usual correspondences. He came in the kind of gray coat that suggested he had recently been abroad. His face had the pallor of someone who had counted too many risks. Marco met him at the threshold, hesitant, and then led him into the library with a care that felt like escorting a possible bomb rather than a guest. Allesia was drawn to that room by a curiosity she could name as what it was: the human appetite to know what transaction would be proposed. The man introduced himself. "Matters of commerce," he said, and then, after a moment's inconsequential talk, placed a thin envelope on the table without showing its contents. "I hear you broker things of consequence," he said to Dante. "I have a matter that will need a hand that keeps steady." Dante took the envelope as one takes a thing that may be used or discarded, and slid it with the back of a knife. The papers were a claim of sorts, land disputes in a neighboring province, something that involved men who were quick with knives and slower with oaths. As Dante read, his face remained almost impassive, but his hand tightened at the edge of the paper. "This is dangerous," he said at last. "It could turn a man into an enemy and a friend into a liability." "Which is why I came to you," the man said. "You are used to turning liabilities into ledgers that pay." There was flattery in the words, but they were also a provocation. Dante looked at Allesia. "You asked why I brought you here," he said softly. "This is why. To show you the kinds of storms that do not come from the sky." She heard the finger pressed on the map of the world she had entered. The claim on the paper extended beyond names. It dragged with it a past debt, a debt with teeth.
Guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Início das instruções. Você é um narrador palestrante com voz potente, forte e autoritária. O tom deve ser firme e inabalável. Contexto de continuidade. A frase anterior era "dragged with it a past debt, a debt with teeth." Você está no meio de uma frase-pensamento. Mantenha o ritmo e a força vocal sem quebrar a conexão. Haja como se estivesse transmitindo uma verdade fundamental. If Dante took the matter, it would mean binding their household in a conflict whose edges could cut through those she loved. Yet, if he refused, he would leave the field open for an enemy to swallow what was left of the Moretti network's influence, and perhaps reach into their household as retribution, a knife offered as a lesson to show where loyalties lay. She felt, in that small tilt of ribs, the ledger grow heavier. Her family was not merely a set of bodies to be protected. They were lines in a balance that, when tipped, might spill blood. "Is there a way to resolve it without blood?" she asked, not knowing whether she asked for herself or for the guest. Dante's eyes studied her, and for a moment the man who kept careful measures became a man who measured the measurer. "There are always ways," he said, "but they cost in other currencies. Favors, silence, pieces of property, or," he paused, "or someone who can speak a language the other side recognizes." The guest looked between them. "You have people connected," he said. "You have influence." A dozen small trajectories unrolled in Allesia's mind. A negotiation that degraded to a threat. Her family dragged into the calculus. She felt the shape of a choice forming. The sort that, once chosen, becomes an instruction. She could remain silent, allow Dante and the household's machinery to decide, and in that silence hope the machine chose without consuming them. Or she could step forward and offer what she had learned in the weeks of being deliberate: names, small contacts, stories of debts repaid. None of it freed anyone of cost.
It only shifted where the cost would fall. Marco's hand found hers under the table, a light, complicit pressure. His eyes asked whether her courage matched her calculation. He had become, in these weeks, not merely a guardian, but a partner in the arithmetic of survival. "Let me speak," Allesia said, and her voice surprised even herself with its steadiness. Dante's mouth turned, briefly, into the expression of a man both amused and curious. "Very well," he said, "speak." She rose and stood before men used to receiving petitions, the small woman who still felt like a cipher in this house, but who had practiced being deliberate in front of mirrors of linen and silver. She told them what she had seen, what she knew in fragments. A farmhand's debt paid by a cousin in the city, a merchant's habit of sending men to collect where coin was not forthcoming, the way favors were exchanged under certain roofs. She did not pretend expertise. She offered options, names, the raw materials of negotiation. When she spoke of names, it was not with the breezy certainty of a clerk balancing accounts. It was with the careful humility of someone who had learned to speak in margins. The room listened. Dante's hand tapped once on the table, a metronome for decisions.
The guest, gray coat, hazard in his eyes, took her suggestions and turned them over like a man testing the weight of gold. "You know these people," he said finally. "You moved among them." "Only in pieces," she answered, "enough to find a path that makes the men consider a different cost." Dante's gaze was a ledger's column added and subtracted. "You are daring," he said. "I am trying to keep my family whole," she said. "I will accept the cost of whatever this requires that I can offer." The words hung in the library like a dampness before thunder. Dante measured the cost in his mind, a private calculation that might include letting the household be attacked in the press of alliances or defending it by other, more delicate instruments. He could imagine, for the first time, the notion of using Allesia not as a shadow to be managed, but as a person whose choices could be leveraged with more finesse than brute force. "Good," he said at last, "then we will proceed with caution." There was relief as sharp as a cut and as immediate as breath, an opening in the ledger that might allow for repair. Marco let out a breath he had been holding, the tension easing from his shoulders. The guest folded his hands like a man who had come to buy a particular kind of assurance. But even as negotiations began to form into plans, names exchanged, times set, a messenger dispatched, Allesia understood something else. The bargain she had made, once signed, would not allow her to retreat entirely into the private boxes of the house. It would require her to move among people as both instrument and negotiator, to be the hinge around which the household might turn. That role would demand more than deliberate postures. It would demand choices that could not always be neatly recanted. She felt then that the ring in her pocket had shifted its weight. It was not yet a chain, nor was it a key. It was, for now, a promise to walk a path whose surface was uneven. She would have to learn to choose at every crossing, to mark when to yield and when to press, to let small refusals accumulate into a life that could be said, one day, to belong to her. When the guest left and the visitor's departure hollowed the villa of the mercurial warmth of strangers, Dante sat alone for a long time with the paper on the table. Through the window, the sea was a darkening smear. Allesia stood by the shelves, her hand on a spine as if to steady herself not with the world, but against it. "You did well," Dante said again, but this time with a different edge, less a report card, more an observation. She nodded. "I have to learn more." He considered that.
"We will teach you," he said, "but remember what that entails." She thought of Maria's instruction, of Marco's watchfulness, of the ledger that now had new entries in unknown ink. "I know," she said. Outside, the harbor swallowed light.